I know it's not the usual style for these overview of research idea sessions to be devoted to methodological issues, but perhaps it's somewhat apropos that this is coming at the heels of this year's Nobel Prize in economics, which was granted to 3 very influential economists that helped to propel the so-called credibility revolution. And the reason is that, as it turns out, we've recently discovered that one of the main workhorse estimation approaches that we've been using during this revolution, the so-called staggered difference in differences estimation that we use for causal inference in applied economic settings, has some very significant and troubling issues. Now, just as background, I should say, by the way, that most of what I'm going to present today comes from a working paper that I've been with Andrew Baker, who is online here, and David Larger, both from the Stanford GSB. So the 3 of us went and looked in the literature in the top 5 accounting and finance journals published over the last 20 years, just to get a sense of how many different diff papers are there, and among them, what proportion of them use staggered diff and diff designs. And there's been about 750 over the last 20 years. And out of those, 55% use staggered diff and diff designs. And this is an increasing trend over time. We're being very careful about identification, and we're using these standard methodologies to help us do causal inference. Almost the whole set of these diff and diff and staggered diff and diff papers have been published really in the last 10 years, since 2010. So it's great that we're being careful about causal identification, but what's the problem? Over just the last 4 years or so, econometricians have begun to study what these staggered difference and differences regressions give us. And it turns out they're not consistent for the usual causal parameters of interest. The usual estimate of interest is the average treatment effect on the treated, the ATT. But generally speaking, staggered difference and differences estimates don't give us that. In fact, the staggered difference and differences estimates can be in the opposite sign of the true ATT. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, but don't we have problems like this already in applied economics? Don't we know that if we omit an important correlative variable, that you can get exactly these kinds of treatment effect estimate biases that can go in the opposite sign as the true treatment effect? And in some sense, that's true, but this problem is really more pernicious because it exists even if you can perfectly randomized treatment. Okay, think about that. That seems extremely worrisome to me. Even when you can perform randomization of treatment assignment, which is the gold standard for how we think about the ideal for doing causal inference, when you run one of these staggered different regressions, you can still get this bias where the treatment effect estimate goes in the opposite direction as the true effect. Now, what's at stake? Hopefully, this is quite obvious. Those of us in applied economics doing finance research, accounting research, political science research, law research have asked many important managerial policy questions where the identification of causal effects rely on these staggered treatment assignment designs. In the literature that I work in, which has been obsessed about the costs and the benefits of managerial entrenchment, many important papers have been written that leverage the staggered adoption of state anti-takeover statutes. In related literature, people have examined, well, what are the effects of capital market pressures on corporate investment policies? And in that literature, there's a variety of papers that exploit the kind of staggered closures or mergers of brokerage firms to identify the effects on firm policies from changes in analyst coverage. What's the effect of interstate banking deregulation? This is a hugely important policy question for which there's been a cottage industry of papers written. In the accounting literature, we've really tried to understand the effects of financial comparability on capital markets. And there, many papers leverage the staggered adoption of IFRS across countries. So many big, important policy, managerial, governance questions that we've done a lot of work around, for which now there might be this question about, wait, what are we sure that we have the right answer? So a lot is at stake. What I'm going to do today is to talk to you at a fairly high level about these problems. I'm going to build it up from the ground up. We're going to start with the basic difference in difference setup, build it all the way up to the two-way fixed effects diff and diff estimator, and talk to you about the intuition for some of the key analytical results out there, to give you an intuition through illustration, and then to explain some of the state-of-the-art fixes that you can immediately apply to your work, because I know, my co-authors and I get a lot of emails from our colleagues, both in finance and accounting. These issues are working their way through the review process. And so I'll talk you through some of the solutions. And by the way, we'll be posting public versions of both R and Stata code that everyone can go and download, and hopefully will be easy to apply to your own work. And at the end of the talk, I'll provide some thoughts and suggestions for future research. I'd like to walk through one replication just as a way to show that, hey, even in really, some of our best papers with great credible claims to identification, these staggered diff and diff problems can really confound inference. I'll share some thoughts about some areas that would be worthwhile for re-examination, and then I'll provide some thoughts, some recommendations for empirical analyses going forward. A few disclaimers. I'm going to try to be fairly high level and focus on the intuition of econometrics issues, the solutions and the implications for applied research. That means I'm going to really try to stay away from technical details, and there's no proofs. If you're interested in these theoretical details, I have a couple of recommendations. So Scott Cunningham, who's an economist at Baylor, has been following these issues and fairly closely from the perspective of an applied person, somebody who's using this. And over the summer, he put together a workshop and uploaded a bunch of videos on YouTube that you can go and watch. So if you YouTube Coachella 2021, there's about 10 videos, and I think a total of 7-8 hours worth of content. It's a very user-friendly coverage of, I think, fairly technical details on these difference in differences problems. And of course, if you'd like, you can go and go through. There's about 5 main papers in this area that you should read. And you'll note, by the way, that all of the published ones are actually all quite recent. They're published in the last 2 years. In fact, in the December issue of the journal Econometrics, 3 of these papers that I'll be talking about are going to be in that issue. So this is very recent, fairly timely stuff. One last disclaimer is that mostly I'm just going to be talking about getting the treatment effect point estimates right, at least directionally. Okay, there are other papers out there. For example, Holger Spamann from Harvard Law School wrote a paper that talks about inference issues or standard error estimation issues when it comes to these staggered diff and diff estimators. We're not going to talk about that today, but of course you're welcome to read those papers. Okay, so let me back all the way up and just going to start from the basics. Hopefully this part will be very obvious to everyone, and then I'm going to build up to the two-way fixed effect estimator. The simplest version of a diff and diff estimator is the 2x2 setup, where you've got one treatment, two time periods, a pre-period, a post-period, and two units, one that receives treatment and one that does not, the control. Okay. I realize I just told you I'm not going to have notation, but here's one of the few areas where I'll introduce a little bit of notation from the potential outcomes framework. So YIT of 0, this will be the value of the outcome for a unit, a firm, a person at time t if it had received treatment. And this is YIT of 1, and YIT of 0 would be the value of the outcome for the same unit at that same time if it does not receive treatment. And what we're usually interested in estimating, the parameter of interest, the estimand, is the average treatment effect on the treated, which is the average difference between the two different outcomes, the counterfactual outcomes, average across all the units that receive treatment. Of course, the fundamental problem of causal inference here is that for any given firm, person, unit, we don't observe both outcomes at the same time. Either they receive treatment or they don't. And so what do? We can't directly estimate ATT. What we can do is to infer the ATT under some technical assumptions, in particular, something called the parallel trends assumption. That's an assumption that says, look, if we can assume that the trend and the control units observed outcomes is going to be the same as the trend and the treatment units outcomes, no treatment condition potential outcomes, then what we can do to estimate the ATT is to take the difference in the differences in the outcomes between the treatment and control units. Okay. Now, if that sounds like a jumble of words, I don't blame you. Hopefully, the visual version here works a bit better. I'm just going to try and explain the same thing, but now in picture form. What we have in panel A are the evolution of outcomes between the treatment and control units. The blue line is the treatment, and the red line is the control. What we're doing in diff and diff really is represented in panel B. It's an implicit imputation of counterfactual outcomes. So how do we see this? Well, first, panel B is going to just normalize the blue and the red lines so that the baseline values are the same. Baseline values don't matter when you're taking differences over time. They get subtracted out. But under the parallel trends assumption, what we're saying is, look, if the treatment units did not receive treatment, their outcome would have evolved according to the red line. And if we can make that assumption, then you can take the difference in the blue line minus the difference in the red line. Okay, so that's the blue bar in panel C minus the red bar in panel C. That difference in the differences gives us the ATT. Okay, I hope this is all fairly straightforward and simple. Now, in practice, we don't actually go and compute these averages by hand. What we do is we shove it all into a regression framework because this is the tool that we love. Regressions are not designed for us to estimate difference in differences, but we can tweak regressions to help us estimate difference in differences. And so the most basic version is to regress the outcome on a series of indicators. An indicator for treatment, that's if you're in the treatment group, DI flips onto 1, a post-period indicator, and then an interaction term, treat times post, which usually gets denoted DIT. And our OLS estimate, the slope coefficient on the interaction term, gives us the ATT estimate. Now, there's several perceived advantages in doing this, and I think that explain why we love to do it this way. One reason is because it gives us two things at the same time. It gives us the point estimate and the standard error in one step, so I don't have to go and compute the standard error separately. A second advantage is that it's easy to generalize this regression to multiple units and multiple periods. It's the same regression in Stata, same format. It's just a different underlying data set. And finally, it's easy to add controls to account for differences across units and time. Now, one way we typically modify this regression to account for differences across units and time is to throw in unit and time fixed effects. This is really the most common specification we tend to see in these diff and diff regressions. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, wait, Charlie, don't people also throw in other kinds of controls to account for time varying differences across units? You're absolutely right. And the reason why I'm not talking about it here, or in the paper that I have with Andrew Baker and Dave Larker, is that it turns out that the inclusion of time varying controls can create its own host of problems. For those of you who are familiar with Pearl and collider problems, of course, those are issues that you have to think about. But Santa Ana and Zhao in their paper point out that when you include these time varying covariates, in order for the diff and diff estimate or slope coefficient to still be consistent for the ATT, you really need to impose a fairly strong set of assumptions for it to work. Okay, I'm really not going to talk about that, but you can, Scott Cunningham's Coachella videos talk about it, or you can go to Santa Ana and Zhao. It's a journal econometrics paper in 2020 that talks about those sets of assumptions. What we do say in the paper is, if you run these kinds of regressions, it's probably a good idea to include a set of results that don't include the time varying covariates, just to verify that your main results are not driven by the inclusion of those covariates. And if they are, it's probably a good idea to figure out how to defend it and why. Okay, so that's not going to be the focus. Those sets of problems are not going to be the focus of the talk today. What I'm going to be focused on instead is the extension or the application of this modified diff and diff regression, this two-way fixed effects regression, to settings with staggered treatment timing. Now, why do we see so many papers that use staggered treatment timing designs? Why don't we just use like a single diff and diff? The typical concern with a diff and diff with a single treatment is, of course, that the critical assumption about the parallel trends could be violated. Typically, it's, hey, is there some contemporaneous trend that could influence your treatment groups and confound the treatment effect? I'll just use one of my papers as an example. I have a paper with Rob Daines at Stanford and Shelley Lee at USC, in which we examined the long-run consequences of staggered boards for smaller early life cycle firms. And here our research design uses a comparison of Massachusetts firms to non-Massachusetts firms. In 1990, the Massachusetts legislature passed a law to mandate the adoption of staggered boards for all Massachusetts incorporated firms. So we use that shock to compare Massachusetts incorporated firms to non-Massachusetts incorporated firms, and we find a set of very interesting results. But you know, a reviewer naturally would be skeptical of this design to the extent that they believe there could be trends that apply to Massachusetts firms that could be different than non-Massachusetts firms. Put differently, had there not been this legislation, with the evolution of the outcomes, say in investments in ROE, ROA, Tobin's Q, would those outcomes evolved differently compared to non-Massachusetts firms that also did not have staggered boards? Is there just a Massachusetts-specific trend that you haven't appropriately controlled for? This is the kind of usual concern that people have when you have a single diff and diff. Now, in general, I think intuitively people would think, oh, well, if you have staggered treatment timing, then your identification strategy might be more credible, because in order for confounding trends to explain this result, these confounding trends need to apply across all the, a bunch of the different treatment cohorts. And it's more complicated to think through why or how that might be the case. This is at least our hypothesis for why staggered different diff settings are considered more credible and quite popular. Well, it turns out, as I mentioned earlier, that actually, Goodman-Bacon is not an econometrician. He's an applied person who's discovered this on his own. So, but in the econometrics literature, we've discovered that these two-way fixed effects, staggered diff and diff regressions, don't give us ATT in general, and in fact, its estimates can have the wrong sign. Let me first just give you the intuition or state the basic results from his paper, and then I'll kind of walk through some illustrations to give you a better intuition, hopefully. What he basically finds is he tries to decompose this slope coefficient, okay, the ATT estimate. And he finds that what it is, it's a variance weighted average of a bunch of 2x2 diff and diffs in the sample. Okay. But some of those 2x2s are very dangerous. They're forbidden comparisons or forbidden 2x2s. And in particular, there are some 2x2s that effectively compare later treated firms, later treated units, to earlier treated units. In other words, the earlier treated units are used as controls in these 2x2s. But when you have dynamic treatment effects, that is when treatment effects can evolve over time, where the full effect takes some time to impound into your outcome, this can create a bias because you're effectively subtracting one effect from another effect. And that's not really what we want when we're trying to estimate ATT. And I think that, and so the presence of dynamic treatment effects is critical in driving these biases. Now you might be thinking, oh, okay, so maybe there aren't dynamic treatment effects, so I don't have to worry. But I tend to think that, in most economic settings, dynamic treatment effects should be the baseline assumption, not one-time treatment effects. Going back to the paper I just talked about on the impact of staggered boards, if we think that protecting managers from external influence induces or allows managers to make more risky investments somehow, and those payoffs take a while to be realized in profitability, then we should see dynamic effects in the long run on profitability. I think dynamic effects, when you think about various different settings, really is the most reasonable baseline assumption. In other words, our job isn't to argue why there are dynamic effects. I think more likely we have to argue why there aren't dynamic treatment effects. And if that's right, then I think this problem really applies at the outset, at a conceptual basis, to much of the applied literature that uses these estimators. Okay, so that's just kind of high level coverage of the results. Now let me just walk you through a very intuitive and useful illustration that's in the Goodman-Bacon paper. He has this simple example with 3 groups, 2 treatment groups and an untreated group. The two treatment groups differ in terms of when they receive treatment. There's an earlier treated group, which is denoted by K, and there's a later treatment group, which is denoted by L. Okay. What his decomposition is doing, or telling us essentially, is that, hey, when you run these two-way fixed effects diff and diff regressions, what's happening in the background is that the regression is computing. I mean, not literally, but this is one way to think about it. In the background, there's 4 simple diff and diffs that are taking place, that are being computed. One is comparing the early treated groups to the untreated groups, okay? And it's making that comparison over the entire sample window. A second 2x2 is a late group comparison to the untreated group comparison, again over the entire sample. But there's 2 more comparisons that are taking place here that involve just the treatment groups. Okay, so these are the timing only comparisons. So one of these is I'm going to compare the early treated group, okay, this is the red line, to the late treated group before the late treated group gets its treatment. So in this window, the late group is used as an effective control, and its treatment status is not changing. And finally, there's a comparison where we compare the late treatment group to an early treatment group, where the early treated group is used as an effective control. And this comparison is taking place after early treated group has received treatment, so that its treatment status is not changing. Okay? And so the two-way fixed effects regression is giving us the some weighted average of all of these 2x2 diff and diffs. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, the problem here comes with this 2x2. When we compare late versus early treatment groups, this is problematic because when treatment effects are dynamic, you're subtracting one unit's treatment effects over time against another group's treatment effects. Okay, this is the so-called forbidden 2x2, and this creates biases. Now, just to be clear, this is a different kind of bias compared to the parallel trends bias. What you'll see here is this is certainly a bias that comes from having bad comparisons, and it might feel intuitively like, oh, isn't that just like the parallel violation of the parallel trends assumption? And technically speaking, it's not. This is something different. And Goodman-Bacon has another decomposition to make this point quite clear. He derives an expression for the probability limit of this two-way fixed effects DID estimate. And he shows that it's got 3 components. The first really is, what would be something like the estimand of interest. It's the variance weighted average treatment effect on the treated. Okay, it's some variance weighted average version of the ATTs across the cohorts. This is the good stuff, the stuff that we want to identify. But there's 2 biases that can be introduced. One is essentially a violation of the parallel trends assumption. This second term is a generalization of a parallel trends assumption. So one way to think about it is if the parallel trends assumption holds across all of the 2x2s before that we saw, then this term would be 0. But there could still be a bias because there's this third term, delta ATT. And this is capturing that dynamic effects, bad comparisons problem in the forbidden 2x2s. What it's capturing is when earlier treated firms are used as effective controls, how much are the changes in the earlier treated firms' unit values reflecting changes in treatment effects? And so you can very well have parallel trends assumptions holding, but still run into this delta ATT bias. Okay. This bias is 0 if all the effects are one-time. They're constant effects, no dynamics. But they're generally non-zero if they're dynamic treatment effects. And the problem is we don't know how to sign this thing. And therefore, the bias can be positive or it can be negative. And this is why we can have the probability limit of this two-way fixed effect different estimate being of a different sign than the true ATT. Okay. Let me now just walk through some simulation illustrations to show you what this might look like what are the situations that are most concerning, and what are the situations that you should be less concerned about. We're going to try and essentially simulate real data and outcomes that finance scholars commonly would encounter or analyze, basically CompuStat and ROA. What we're going to do is we're going to first extract firm fixed effects, time fixed, year fixed effects, and then residuals from the empirical ROA distribution in CompuStat. Then we're going to kind of draw from the empirical distribution to construct simulated ROAs. Okay, we're going to do this 500 times, have 500 ROA panels. And then for each of those panels, we're also going to randomly assign observations to a state of incorporation to determine treatment assignment. Then we're going to introduce 6 different kinds of treatments to each baseline simulated ROA data set, and then take a look at what happens to the two-way fixed effects DID estimator. Okay, the first 3 treatments that we're going to consider are going to have either uniform treatment timing or homogeneous effects. Okay, simulation 1, treatment happens at one time, and then it's a one-time effect. In simulation 2, it's uniform treatment, dynamic effects, and in simulation 3, you have staggered treatment timing, but homogeneous, one-time effects. Okay, these are the situations where two-way fixed effects DID works. Okay, you see the distribution here. They're just plotting the two-way fixed effects estimated coefficients, and then the vertical lines here are the kind of the true ATT. One thing to note here is that because it's an unbalanced data set, there's many ways to take averages of ATTs in this sample. We can take the observation level average, or we can take the firm level average. Okay, we can take average at the firm level, average across firms. We don't really know if there's a true way. If you've got a balanced panel, these things are the same, but we're just showing both. But two-way fixed effects is at least consistent or unbiased for one of these, the firm level average. Okay, so in these settings, Sim 1, 2, and 3, two-way fixed effects is fine. So one thing you'll notice, by the way, is we are fine when we just stick to a simple diff and diff, even when you have dynamic treatment effects. Where the problems come is when you have staggered timing and heterogeneous effects. Okay. In simulation 4, we're going to consider staggered timing with one-time effects, but that are of different sizes, magnitudes across cohorts. Sim 5 has dynamic effects, but where the trend breaks are going to be the same across 3 different cohorts. And in Sim 6, we again have dynamic effects, but the trend breaks are going to differ across the groups. Okay. And in each of these cases, we get biases in our two-way fixed effect estimates. One thing I'll note is Sim 4 has a bias, but maybe that's not the right term in some sense. This difference between the center of the distribution and these the green or red lines is not reflecting a violation of the parallel trends or dynamic treatment effects. We know parallel trends holds here because we control the data generating function, so we know we've set it, made it so that the counterfactual outcomes evolve according to the same trend. We know there's no dynamic treatment effects because we designed it that way. What this is reflecting, in essence, is a different way. OLS is putting a different weighting across the cohort ATTs than the observation level average or the firm average. So in some sense, I think we think of Sim 4's bias as being less problematic because you can still preserve the same sign. Sim 5 and 6 really are the pernicious ones. Okay, these are biases that arise because of the presence of dynamic treatment effects. And In Sim 5, it looks like an attenuation bias because now the coefficient is being pushed very close to 0. But in Sim 6, you see, actually, this is not an attenuation bias problem. We don't, we can, in fact, push the bias, push the coefficient all the way across the 0 boundary and get an opposite sign as the true ATTs. Okay, just to give you some more intuition on what's going on in Sim 6 here, this one, which is the really troubling one. Sim 6 has a bunch of forbidden 2x2s. So what I'm graphing here is one of those forbidden 2x2s in which we're comparing a late treated cohort to an early treated cohort as a control. And what you see is the late treated cohort has a fairly flat outcome evolution that's being compared to the early treated cohort whose outcome evolution is steeper. But this is all treatment effect, or this average is reflecting changes in treatment effects over time. And that's why you're getting a negative effect or a negative DID estimate. And because OLS applies a fairly large weight to this forbidden 2x2, it kind of drags the whole coefficient down all the way to the negative territory. And again, I'll emphasize that this problem with this bad comparisons problem is arising even in the presence of parallel trends assumption holding, which is true here. Let me make just a couple of comments about this, the implications of these biases. It can really influence project selection and in two ways. We can certainly have situations where the two-way fixed effects regression gives you no effect, even though true treatment effects are non-zero in expectation. So this is what we have in simulation 5. In simulation 5, there's true treatment, positive treatment effects across all 3 cohorts, but our estimate suggests it's almost nothing. Okay. In these scenarios, the biases in two-way fixed effects would lead a researcher to reject a good project. They would make a type 2 error. But the opposite can be true. Two-way fixed effects regressions can give you a significant coefficient, even when the true treatment effect is 0 in expectation, in which case the researcher might accept a bad project. This is not in the current version of the paper, but is part of the work that we've been doing. We try to look at this again through simulation. So what we do is the following. We try to basically redo simulation 6. Simulation 6 is one where the trend breaks differ across treatment cohorts. But now what we're going to do is we're going to draw the trend breaks from a distribution centered around 0. So in expectation, there's no effect. Okay. And then we're going to construct our kind of pseudo data sets, run our regressions, and then see what proportions of the time in our simulation do we get an estimate that's statistically significant at the 5% level. And we actually find, hopefully, most of these regressions would be insignificant. But in fact, we find that they're only insignificant in 8.7% of the time. 90% of the time, you're going to get a significant result, even if the true effect in expectation is 0. Okay. We've also repeated this exercise, by the way, by enforcing, at each simulated sample level, we rig it so that the true effect within the sample is 0, either the firm level average or the observation level average, and we still get very similar results. Okay. So a researcher can accept a bad project when true effects are 0. They can these biases can produce significant effects in our regressions because of these two-way fixed effects problems. Now, What we talked about earlier highlights the role of dynamic treatment effects in producing these biases. So you might be thinking, wait, Charlie, so what if we just run these regressions that take into account dynamic effects? Wouldn't they fix these kinds of issues? So commonly, we see papers in these in this area that run these event study regressions, where instead of a single binary treat times post indicator, that treat times post indicator essentially gets decomposed into treat times k periods pre or k periods post treatment. And so you might typically see nice graphs like this. And we do two kinds of things. We look at the post period to see what's happening after treatment. Okay. And then we look at the pre-period as well to help us figure out whether or not they're pre-trends. We can't test the parallel trends assumption directly because that's about counterfactual outcomes. But typically we think about looking at pre-treatment trends as a way to give us some more comfort about the parallel trends assumption. Okay, if there are no pre-trends, we feel more comfortable that parallel trends assumptions is likely to hold. If there are pre-trends, it would make us a little bit more cautious about making that assumption. Okay. And it turns out that in a related paper by Sun and Abraham, also in the December issue of the Journal of Econometrics, Sun and Abraham show that generally speaking, except under fairly strong assumptions, the staggered two-way fixed effect dynamic effect specifications also do not produce reliable dynamic treatment effect estimates, okay? Even under parallel trends and even under no anticipation. Okay. In general, these coefficients in the graphs cannot be interpreted as the average treatment effect on the treated, 1, 2, 3 periods away from treatment. What they show is that each of those estimates is contaminated by a linear combination of average treatment effect on the treated from all other relative periods and all other treatment cohorts in the data set. Okay. So one way to think about that is this coefficient right here, this one, that's 1 period after treatment. This coefficient is contaminated by the ATT from period 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way through. It's entirely contaminated, and that's true of all the relative time indicators. Okay. And this contamination basically doesn't apply only under fairly strict assumptions. You need to assume homogeneous treatment effects across cohort and over time, and you need to assume that excluded relative time periods have average ATTs of 0. Okay. This second assumption, by the way, so typically to avoid collinearity, we have to drop 1 period. And the standard practice is we drop the period right before treatment. And what that assumption is saying is, look, if you're happy to assume no anticipation, which would mean ATTs in the pre-periods are 0, it would suggest that what you should be doing is only dropping periods before treatment. Sometimes papers might accidentally drop post-treatment periods as a benchmark, and that can produce a bias. Okay. So what does this all mean? Well, it means the two things that we like to do with event study designs are invalid. The common practice of interpreting post-treatment relative time indicator coefficients as an estimate of dynamic effects, that's invalid because all of those are confounded by ATTs from all other periods. More troublingly to me, the common practice of interpreting pre-treatment relative time indicator coefficients as tests of pre-trends is also invalid. Okay. What they show is that you can have pre-trends in the two-way fixed effects estimation when true treatment effects are non-zero. Okay, so in that case, researchers will reject a good project. Okay, it can show up that, in this region, it's not, there seems to be a trend, even though parallel trends hold, and in reality, there are no pre-trends, but it just shows up as having pre-trends because of the contamination problem. In that case, the researcher might say, oh, this identification strategy is not credible, I'm not going to be able to sell it, I'm going to kind of drop the project. But the other, the converse is also true. You can have a situation where it looks like there are no pre-trends when pre-trends actually exist. Okay, so you can accept a bad project. Okay. A third point that they make here is how you bin these relative time indicated periods is also very important. How you think about binning per se can create biases. In particular, if the relative time periods in a bin have different treatment effects, that can create a bias. Okay, so this is all maybe a little bit depressing, but my hope is to give the audience a bit of optimism here, because the solutions are, I think, not too complicated, and it's all very easily implementable. There's currently 3 kinds of solutions that are in published papers. 2 that are kind of formally derived in the journal Econometrics. And then there's another solution that have been applied by applied researchers in finance and in economics called stack regression. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about that one, because it's one that, at least for me, somebody who still loves OLS, and I'm lazy, and so I don't want to be pushed out of my, my Stata OLS routine, is one that's fairly easy to implement right away. But the general idea behind all of the fixes is to simply avoid the 2x2 problem and ensuring that each treatment cohort is compared to a clean set of controls. And those clean set of controls could either be not yet treated units, last treated units, or never treated units. Not all designs have never treated units, so you have to choose between not yet treated or last treated. Another way to think about it is, look, let's just run the simple 2x2s, clean 2x2s with a single treatment, and then figure out a way to aggregate it up. And that's basically what all these fixes are. Okay. Callaway and Santana Ana and Sun and Abraham are very similar papers, and what their solutions are to essentially compute the cohort period specific ATT. Okay. And once you have all these cohort period specific ATTs, they figure out ways to aggregate up. Callaway and Santana Ana talk about various different ways of doing it. Sun and Abraham provide one particular way you can do it in a 3-step estimator. They differ in execution. They differ a bit in the choice of control groups, flexibility, and inference. In fact, Sun and Abraham can be thought of as a special case of Callaway and Santana Ana under some conditions, but I kind of group them together because they're conceptually quite similar. Well, I'm going to talk a bit more about the stacked regression approach. So let me illustrate what I mean here through a simple example where you've got 4 treatment timing groups here. Okay, and what's going to happen, what the idea here is to create a bunch of clean 2x2 data sets, meaning in each one, you should be able to run a simple diff and div involving a treatment and a control group. Okay. And just note that from a data set set up like this, you can really create only 3 clean 2x2s, because the 2016 cohort here, there's no control group that we can create for it. So we can't identify this effect, the pre and post 2016 effect. Okay. So it's going to look something like this. Okay, I'm going to take the first cohort, and I'm just going to use the not yet treated units, match them up, and create this first stack data set. For the 1998 cohort, I'm going to create a separate stack data set using the 07 and 16 cohorts before their treatment. And then 07, I can use 2016. Now I'm going to stack these things up into one single data set. Then I'm going to run a two-way fixed effects, diff and diff regression. Same kind of specification that we're used to running on the stack data. The only thing I need to tweak is instead of using time and unit fixed effects, I'm going to include data set specific time and data set specific unit fixed effects. Okay, so that will tell OLS to basically, in essence, we're running the diff and diffs within each stack data set, but then OLS is going to find a way to kind of weight these different diff and diffs. Okay, so we look at the distribution of these different estimators in our simulation exercise, and all three do quite well, in fact. In Sim 1, 2, and 3, they're all fairly centered around 0. I mean, Sun and Abraham and Callaway and Santa Ana are all unbiased for the firm average ATT. You get some differences when it comes to stack regressions. They can be a little bit biased, but I would say the magnitude of that bias is not a big deal, at least in this simulation. And that bias simply comes from a different way OLS thinks about weighting the different ATTs as compared to Callaway, Santa Ana, and Sun and Abraham. Okay, and in general, OLS is going to weight those ATTs in a way to improve efficiency. We know that's one of the properties of OLS as an estimator, and that's why you'll see, for example, that this green distribution tends to look thinner. Okay, it's more precise, but there can be a little bit of a bias, and so there's a trade-off being made here. And they also work well when it comes to the dynamic event study specifications as well. Okay. So what are the trade-offs? I already talked a little bit about them. When it comes to CS, SA versus stacked, theoretically speaking, CS and SA are, we know that they're consistent for the ATT under the appropriate set of assumptions. Stack regression really is, let's call it, an intermediate solution for the lovers of OLS. CS and SA is also more flexible in that because you're estimating each individual cohort period specific ATT, you have much more flexibility in terms of how you want to weight them. You can take different kinds of averages. You can plot the entire distribution of cohort time ATTs for kind of non-parametric inference. Stacked is attractive because, well, we get to stay within OLS two-way fixed effects. It's easy to add covariates, provided all the kind of caveat that I gave you before in the beginning. It's more efficient, but it applies OLS weights. In terms of CS versus SA, I think Sun and Abraham is, to me, simpler. It's faster to execute. I'm primarily a Stata user. There's an author-written package in Stata. Doesn't rely on bootstrap inference like CS, which slows it down. But it's not as flexible. It's not as flexible as CS because CS allows for different ways to specify clean controls. It has a regression, outcome regression estimator, an inverse probability weighted estimator, a doubly robust estimator. So it's a lot more flexible, and in fact, it nests Sun and Abraham's estimator under no covariates and never treated controls. Okay, it also uses simultaneous confidence intervals that are valid for the entire path of the ATT. So CS would be the one if I were to go outside of the two-way fixed effects stack regression framework. CS would be the one that I typically recommend. Okay, so this is really it in terms of the issues and the solutions. And in the remaining time, I'd like to just share with you a little bit about my own thoughts about areas in research that has relied on this type of design. What are some areas that I personally think would be interesting to investigate or reinvestigate? And I'll conclude with a set of kind of pragmatic suggestions about the work that we're all doing. So I went in and just looked through a bunch of these papers we collected to see what are some of the really common shocks that people use in these staggered diff and diff papers. There's typically people have these staggered diff and diff designs where there's shocks across states, across countries, or across firms. State anti-takeover statutes is a very, very common one. There's like more than 1,000 papers written on these shocks. Interstate banking deregulations we talk about. Inevitable disclosure doctrine is becoming more popular these days. Across countries, IFRS adoption is a common one. The board reforms across countries, legalization of share repurchases. There's just been a couple of papers published on this. Now, let me talk about just three. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but simply a reflection of my personal work and my preferences. I think one area that would be certainly interesting to go back and re-examine would be the literature that examined the costs and benefits of managerial entrenchment. There's a cottage industry of papers written in finance and economics, and to some extent in accounting, that tries to identify the variation in managerial exposure to the market for corporate control by using the staggered adoption of anti-takeover statutes across states. So these are business combination laws, fair price laws, control share statutes. And I think, I don't know if this is true, but Bertrand and Mullinath certainly comes to mind as one of these. I don't know if it's the first one, but certainly a very salient one that uses this identification strategy. But there's a puzzle here that for a long time, my legal colleagues have critiqued what we scholars in finance, accounting, and economics do in this literature, because they don't believe that these statutes really have any economic bite. These statutes limit what a corporator can do once it becomes a majority shareholder in order to provide some protection to minority shareholders and their rights. But the puzzle is that most of these statutes were passed in the era of poison pills. And in the presence of poison pills, raters basically would never be able to acquire a significant block above 15 or 20%, let alone a majority stake. And therefore, this would be second or third order effects at best. This is according to legal theory. And yet we have many papers documenting, large economic effects along various different dimensions. And so this is the puzzle. And this debate or fight, let's call it, continues even today. And so perhaps one way to resolve this puzzle, or one reason why this puzzle exists, could simply be that some of the earlier results could be confounded by this delta ATT type of bias with staggered diff and diff regressions. I think this would be a very interesting area to look into. Another area which is related topically is what's the effect of analyst coverage on corporate policies? We have a couple of fairly recent JFE papers that look at the effect on investments and innovation. More generally, we have a bunch of papers that try to identify the effects of analyst coverage, or let's call it market scrutiny or market attention, on various corporate outcomes by using the staggered brokerage closures or mergers shock. And I noticed that, there's, at least in the literature that looks at investments and innovation, there appears to be a set of contradictory results that use the same identification strategy. Now, they examine different kinds of outcomes. One examines patents, the other one examines R&D and CapEx, but I still think, R&D and patents seem fairly similar in nature. I don't know what drives these conflicting results, but it seems worthwhile to go back and re-examine some of the evidence that we have that leverage these staggered brokerage closures or merger shocks. And finally, the effects of interstate banking deregulation. Again, this is another area where there are lots and lots of important papers that have been written. It's truly an important and policy relevant topic. And one where we want to make sure we really get the right answers. And so here, what I'd like to do is to provide you with an illustration for how some of these problems can actually show up in papers. We really want to demonstrate that these are problems that don't exist just in theory, but very much are likely to apply in applied research settings in finance and accounting and law. And we do that in part through our simulation exercise by simulating these data sets that look like the ones that we use. But I'd like to also just walk through one replication exercise I think quite a very good paper by Beck, Levine, and Levkov on big bad banks. Let me, before I proceed, just say the following, because I really, I was a bit wary of doing this because I don't like doing this, and I don't want this to be perceived in any way as an attempt to knock the paper or the authors for what they did. This is a really carefully done paper with credible claims to causal identification. Okay, these guys applied the best available methodologies at the time. That is before the advent of this new literature. And so the following is just meant to illustrate that even for the best papers that we have in the literature with credible claims to causal identification, that these staggered two-way fixed effects diff and diff regressions can create genuine inference challenges. And so for the rest of us, for all of us, we, in all of the work that we do, to the extent they involve these kinds of designs, it's probably worthwhile for us to make the investment to study these kinds of issues and perhaps revisit some of our old results. Maybe there are old papers or projects that we've thrown away for the wrong reasons. And we can revisit those as well. But I really want to emphasize that this is a very strong paper that kind of applied the best available methodology at the time. Okay, what they do is to exploit the across-state variation in interstate banking deregulation to analyze the impact of deregulation on income inequality. And so the replication here is only going to focus on one outcome they look at, one of the various outcomes they look at. We're going to focus on the log of the Gini index. Okay, and what they find, which is these first two columns here, we're able to replicate their results exactly. Okay, and we, with and without controls, banking deregulation led to a decline in the Gini index. Now, when we apply the fixes, Twoway, Santana, and stack regression, we get a treatment effect estimate that's in the opposite sign. And in the case of the stack regression stack regression specification, we get a significant coefficient as well. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, Goodman-Bacon, by the way, has, there's a data package in which you can apply a decomposition of the data that'll tell you, that'll do the decomposition of your two-way fixed effects diff and diff for you. And it'll tell you what is the estimate from early versus late treated, and what is the estimate from the later versus early treated 2x2 estimates, comparisons, okay? And what happens in this data is that these forbidden 2x2s, later versus earlier, they get a negative coefficient, and OLS is applying a rather large weight in the overall estimate. So this would be like a classic example of a situation where the two-way fixed effect bias is likely, is particularly troubling if you think there could be dynamic treatment effects. Okay. We also look at their event study specification, where they find this really nice downward looking trend. Okay, in the pre-period, there's no particular trend. And then we see right after deregulation in the first year, and then over the next 15 years, we get these bars to shift downwards and below zero. Okay, so that's consistent with their regression results. One thing we noted, and this is one of the important points of Sun and Abraham, is that how you bin per se can create a bias. The only way it doesn't create a bias is if the post-treatment periods in the bin, you can assume to have the same homogeneous treatment effects, the same ATT. So in general, our recommendation is, don't really bin unless if you have a strong reason to articulate why you have homogeneous treatment effects. And it turns out if we just relax the binning, so what they do is they bin at 15, at all the relative time periods beyond 15 and prior to, or more than 10 years prior to 15, gets put into these bins. Once we relax those and we just plot the t to 15 and then 0 to minus 10 relative time indicators, we get a very different shape here, which is consistent exactly with the theoretical findings of Sun and Abraham. So binning can really create a huge impact on the shape of these event study plots. Okay. More generally, when we apply Callaway-Santa Ana or stack regression to look at the dynamics of treatment effects, we don't find much here. If anything, we find a little bit of a positive effect 7-8 years out. We don't find much here with a stack regression design. Okay. So to conclude here, we have a ton of papers using staggered diff and diff estimation across different domain areas in finance, in accounting, in law and political science. And these designs, if you leverage them by running two-way fixed effects regressions, can potentially produce very severe biases, ones that can exist even if you're fairly certain that there's randomization in treatment assignment. This field is advancing fairly quickly in figuring out the diagnostics and remedies to this issue. I think it seems like we're at the end of kind of this body of literature that's all working on this at the same time. And so hopefully we're kind of converging on a set of best practices. But I think that there are some things we can do right now, or should be doing right now in our own work, just to insulate ourselves from criticism. So here are 3 sets of recommendations for applied empiricists in finance. For those of you, if you're like me, if you like to stay within OLS and two-way fixed effects, here's a few thoughts. If you have either a single treatment, or if you can assume homogeneous treatment effects, then keep running your standard two-way fixed effects regressions. Okay, they're efficient, they're the best, no problem. If you're in the latter category, you have staggered treatment assignment, but you think you have homogeneous treatment effects. At minimum, I think you have to provide a theory for why that's true. Okay, I don't know how people how referees, how our colleagues will respond to these ways of justifying the use of two-way fixed effects. But one thing I would note is that in principle, we can probably test this hypothesis, the homogeneous effects of homogeneous effects, by essentially estimating the cohort time specific ATTs, either through CS or SA, Callaway, Santana, or Sun and Abraham, and just seeing how different those effects are. Seems to me, in principle, you can test those theories. Another thing you can do is you can get a sense of the likelihood of the bad comparisons problem, or articulate why it's not likely to be a problem if you want to be running these regressions. So plot treatment timing. Just how staggered are they? There are some cases where they're so close together, it's as if you're just doing a single diff and diff. In other settings, not. When you can, I think it's a good idea to decompose your two-way fixed effects diff and diff. So Goodman-Bacon has a really nice decomposition. You can download the stata package and run it. The only caveat is that it only applies for balanced data settings. Okay. Another thing that could be useful is knowing what proportion of your observations in your analysis data set that are never treated. In the next version of our paper, we're going to include an analysis that shows that basically the magnitude of this delta ATT bias diminishes as the percentage of observations that are never treated increases. And in our simulation, once you get to, I think, 70% or 80% of the data constituting that are never treated, the bias is basically negligible. Also, this problem is more pronounced when you can expect larger long-run effects, because in those bad 2x2s, where early treated firms are used as controls, their evolution of their outcomes are used as the counterfactuals. And so if you have large long-run effects, where those deltas are going to be big when they're used as effective control groups, the problem is likely to be worse. With both differential treatment timing and a lack of prior theory for homogeneous treatment effects, I would say just don't use two-way fixed effects at least the traditional two-way fixed effects. Use something like stack regression. Okay. What about the remedies? Yep, if you want to stay within two-way fixed effects world, use stack regression as a baseline. Or alternatively, if you don't have a ton of treatment groups, you could just run simple diff and diffs, 2x2s, and report them separately. As I mentioned before, if you're using covariates, I would report results with and without covariates. My guess is that there might be another set of papers that are devoted precisely to this issue down the road. And so it might be a good idea just to insulate yourself from that. If you want to use a more flexible solution, I would use Callaway and Santa Ana. But one thing to note is that you need to think a little bit carefully about how you want to aggregate these period cohort specific ATTs. Regardless of these methods, I mean, all of them basically tries to fix up the comparison group so to avoid the kind of forbidden 2x2 comparisons. But it would be useful to think about, because you have a lot of flexibility about which comparison groups to use, it'd be good to think about how to justify them. The choice of window over which you're going to do this analysis will depend on how much treatment effect anticipation you think there might be. For example, if you're going to use a not yet treated unit as a control unit for a treatment group, you should think about for how long you want to do this. Because if you think those control units could have anticipatory effects, say 2-3 years before they receive treatment, then you probably want to cut the window off at the time when those anticipatory effects can come in. Otherwise, you run into the same kinds of issues where you're comparing different, treatment effects to treatment effects. Okay. Finally, there may be some cases where results truly depend on the use of prior treated units, and you may have very good reasons for why those prior treated units are actually good controls. You just have to articulate to the reader why that's the case. Okay. Finally, on event study designs, I'll just say two things that I learned from reading this literature and working on this paper. One is I would avoid binning post-treatment relative times unless if you have really good reasons to believe that there are homogeneous effects in those periods that you're binning. So you must have a really good theory, or I suppose really good institutional knowledge that helps you articulate that assumption. I would think about manually specifying the reference period. As I mentioned earlier, in these event study regressions or plots, you need to leave at least one period out to avoid multicollinearity. It turns out if you have settings where there's no never treated unit, so everybody eventually gets treated, you need to drop two relative time periods to avoid multicollinearity. Now, if you don't do that manually and you run this thing in Stata, Stata will make a decision to drop a relative time period for you. And that can often be a post-period relative time period. And that can create a bias as well. So I would manually drop these things myself. And again, the reference period of choice, which one you want to drop, what's the benchmark period, that's going to depend on what you think, how much of an anticipatory effect there could be. The more there could be anticipation prior to treatment, the further back you should go in time in your specification. So